Hello everyone, I am the Desert Gardener, and I have what I think is probably going to be the most important video I've done to date. And I'm going to make a compilation of what I think are the 10 most important tips, tricks, and myths that every gardener should know. So I've got my tea, or at least as far as you know. Let's get started. Now, a little background before we get started. Now, as I've mentioned before, I had very altruistic motives when I started this channel. I knew I wasn't going to make any money off of it. I was just really frustrated with the amount of misinformation I was seeing on the internet about gardening, especially on Facebook and Reddit. And because of that, I had a tendency to get into discussions with people on many of these subjects. And I expected a certain amount of pushback. I think that's normal, that's human nature. If you tell somebody something that they have believed to be true for a long period of time is incorrect, they have a tendency to get defensive. And I think that's normal, and it doesn't matter how nice you are, how much evidence you have, how many links to different scientific studies you have. They don't read it, they just attack the messenger. Well, unfortunately, recently, a couple people went above and beyond just simply being defensive. They got rude and threatening. So I started wondering, why am I doing this? If you guys want to believe unsubstantiated myths and rumors, it's really no skin off my nose. I'm just trying to help. So I may take a step back here for a little bit. So this may be the last video I'm going to do for a little while. I haven't fully decided. But I wanted to leave you with a compilation of what I think are the most important tips that I've talked about thus far, plus a few that I haven't yet talked about. They were going to be the subject of future videos. So let's get started. So the big elephant in the room is the one that I've referred to many times, and that's blossom end rot. Now, there was a time many years ago where we thought blossom end rot was caused by a calcium deficiency. Now, fortunately, research scientists that are way smarter than myself have figured out that that's not the case. It actually has to do with a lack of calcium movement, not a calcium deficiency. So adding calcium isn't going to help at all. So what does cause blossom end rot? Well, it's caused by something called abiotic stress. Now, abiotic stress can be caused by a number of different things. Now, I'll just talk about the three most common ones, the ones that's most likely to be experienced by a home user like yourself. And the first one is salinity. And salinity is caused most often by overuse of fertilizers, especially chemical fertilizers and things like Epsom salts. They're very high in salts, and it can cause problems. The next one is drought. And this is an easy one. Simply even and consistent watering will fix this one. So you might recommend getting a timer so you don't have to worry about it. It gets watered at the exact same rate and time every day. This will go a long way. And the next one is heat, especially when the heat is drastic and going back and forth between hot and cold and hot and cold. This can cause problems with the plant. Now, there are a number of things you can do here. You can put a sunshade over the top of your plants. This will help shade when it starts getting really hot, especially here in the desert. When it gets over 90 or 100, I put a shade cloth over my plants. If they're in containers, easy enough, you can just pick them up and move them into the shade. You also want to plant them a good distance apart. That way you get a good airflow in between. This will help keep things cool. You'll also want to get rid of any weeds and get rid of lower branches. This will also help with airflow. And you also don't want to plant right next to a structure. This will also limit your airflow and heat things up, as well as right next to anything that's going to reflect the sunlight. So if you plant right next to a wall, the sun's going to hit that wall, bounce onto your plants, and it's going to make it much harder. Now, or much hotter. Now, if you live in a cold region, that's probably not a big deal. But if you're here in the desert, heat is a big concern. So if you take these three things into consideration, you're much less likely to get blossom end rot. Adding calcium is not going to help. Now, another thing you can do is stay away from plants that are more susceptible to blossom end rot. For example, beefsteak tomatoes and Roma tomatoes can be very susceptible to blossom end rot, whereas cherry tomatoes are practically immune because they ripen so quickly. So if you're having a problem, maybe just switch to cherry tomatoes. This will help a lot. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is taking kitchen scraps and putting in your garden. Now, I've seen a number of videos on YouTube that talk about taking eggshells, you bake them, you put them in a coffee grinder, you grind them up into a fine powder, and you put them in your garden. Well, the problem with this is eggshells are not water soluble. So they have to first be broken down by the enzymes in your soil before your plant can even absorb them. So how long does that take? Well, anywhere from 3 months to more than a year. So if you're trying to give, say, extra calcium to your tomato plants, those plants are going to be dead and gone before that becomes available. Now, maybe they'll help next year's plants, but really, why are you doing it? Have you had a soil test done? Do you know your soil is deficient in calcium? If so, you really shouldn't be doing it. And if it is, there's simply better ways to do it, like garden gypsum or seabird guano. They're water soluble. They'll be available to your plants right away. Now, what about other things that will break down more quickly, like, say, banana peels? Well, they do break down more quickly. Unfortunately, they'll also mold. They'll bring fungus, bugs, rodents, things you don't really want in your garden. So you really shouldn't be putting these in your garden. You should get a composter or a compost pile, put your kitchen scraps there, and then at the beginning of next year, spread it out over your garden when it's fully composted. Your plants will love that. That is a much better idea. Now, the third thing I wanted to talk about is the myth about not watering your plants during the day. Now, the myth here is if you water your plants during the day, the water droplets will get on the leaves, and the sun will use those water droplets like a little magnifying glass and burn your leaves. This is not true. This does not happen. Where this myth came from is people who live in areas that have very high humidity. What happens is, because the humidity is so high, the water droplets take longer to evaporate. And then mold, fungus, and other things like that will take hold and make little brown spots on the leaves. It has nothing to do with the sun. People saw them and just assumed that. We've since figured out that is not the case. In fact, watering during the day doesn't hurt anything. In fact, if you live in the desert like I do, it's actually a good thing because it'll keep your plants cooler on hot days. So it won't hurt anything. Now, the only downside to watering during the day is there will be more evaporation, but that's easily compensated for by simply watering more or a little bit longer. But getting your plants wet, not going to hurt it. That's just silly. So the next thing we wanted to talk about is gophers. Now, I made a couple of videos on getting rid of gophers, and they're probably my most watched videos, so that I assume they're definitely a big problem. Now, in my first video, I talked about putting things that they don't like the smell of in their tunnels, things like dryer sheets, and they do work pretty well. However, I later discovered that the use of predator urine works even better. So I picked up some red fox urine online, and this works fantastic. Just a few squirts on an open hole. They think there's a predator in the area, and they leave. Now, I definitely recommend getting one that has a spout or a sprayer like this. A lot of the ones I see online, it's just a bottle with a cap. And this stuff doesn't really smell very good, so you don't want to get it all over the place. Having a sprayer is really a good idea, and it really works well. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is pre-soaking your pepper seeds. Now, there seems to be a lot of controversy about this. Some people recommend it, some don't. Now, there have been some studies. In fact, I remember one done by some folks at UC Davis, and they soaked pepper seeds in hydrogen peroxide for just about 10 minutes, and then took some seeds that weren't soaked, planted them both, and they did get a better germination rate with the ones that were soaked. Now the hydrogen peroxide will kill germs and things like that, and it does seem to be helpful. Now there's also another method, and this is the one that I actually use, and that's where I soak it in a warm diluted chamomile tea solution. Now chamomile tea will work similar to the hydrogen peroxide and get rid of any germs and fungus and anything like that. But because they're being soaked in a warm solution for a longer period of time, 12 to 24 hours, it also does what's called scoring the seed, or softens the seed. It's similar to what happens when a bird eats a pepper seed. Can't digest it, it just passes through their system, it softens it, and it makes it more likely to germinate once it comes out the other side. And this seems to really work. Now, if you've been planting your seeds and not doing this and you get a good germination rate, then there's no reason to do it. You know, if it's not broke, don't fix it. But I was having really poor germination rates, about 10%. So when I started using the warm tea solution, it went up to more than 90. So it was a huge raise in my germination rate. So that's why I definitely recommend it if you're having a similar problem. Now, the next one I want to talk about is seed storing. Now, a lot of people will buy seeds online, and they come in those little Ziploc envelopes or little Ziploc bags. Now, this is a bad way to store seeds. Plastic doesn't breathe and holds in moisture, as well as they're clear, so they're exposed to light. So you really should put them in an envelope like this one here. Let me grab it. Now this is what's called a coin envelope. Now you can get a lot of different sizes, but because it's paper, it will absorb any moisture, which helps the seed last longer, which also gets rid of any fungus and things like that that might be on the seed. And because it's opaque, it'll protect it from light. Now once you get it in an envelope like this, you put it in your refrigerator. A cool, dry, dark place will help the seeds last longer. Now don't put them in your refrigerator, or your freezer. Don't put them in the freezer. Your refrigerator works best. And if you saw the larger video I did on this, I had talked about how I had taken some tomato seeds that were more than 20 years old and planted them, and they were doing great. You probably can't see, they're in my garden over there, and they're growing great. So seeds will last a long time if you treat them properly, or if you store them properly. In fact, you may be familiar with the Bale study. It's currently going on at Michigan State. What happened was they took a bunch of seeds and they buried them in some pill bottles with some sand, and they buried them actually on campus. Didn't tell anybody where they were, and every 5 years they dug them up and planted them. Now, they were all sprouting, so they kept putting it off. Went to 10 years, went to 20 years. This study is now one of the longest scientific studies in history. And this year was one of the years they dug the bottles up and planted them. And sure enough, a bunch of them sprouted after 142 years. Now the extra 2 years was because of the coronavirus. They had to postpone it for a bit. But after 142 years of being kept cold, dry, and in the dark, many of these seeds still sprouted. So treat your seeds good, and they will last a lot longer than most people think they will. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is birds. Now, a lot of people will talk about ways to get rid of birds from your lawn and garden. And that's really a bad idea, because birds are a beneficial creature in your garden. Many of them will eat bugs, so that's a good thing. So you want to actually attract them to your garden. So people might say, well, they're pecking at my tomatoes and my apricots. What do I do about it? Well, they're not pecking at those fruits because they're hungry. They're pecking at them because they're thirsty. So you need to give them a clean water source for them to drink. Now, I don't know if you can see in the background, I have a bird bath back there with a little fountain, and the birds love it. They're always coming in and out and drinking from the fountain. And they leave my tomatoes and apricots alone. So don't try to get rid of them, try to attract them. Give them food, give them water, give them a place to nest, like bird houses and shrubs and stuff that they can nest in, and they'll leave your fruits and vegetables alone. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is putting fertilizer in your planting hole. Now this is a big one, and I see this a lot. I've literally seen hundreds of different YouTube videos where they'll dig a hole, they'll throw fertilizer in, and then they'll plant their little seedlings in the hole on the fertilizer. Now this is really a bad idea for a couple of reasons. Now the first reason is many fertilizers will actually burn the roots of your exposed plant when you put them in. Now this is of course a bad idea, burning the roots. It'll kill some of the roots, set your plant back. This is really a bad idea. The other reason is, and there was a study, again I think it was at UC Davis, where what they did is they took a bunch of fruit trees and they planted them. Now they put fertilizer in the holes of half of them and no fertilizers in the hole of the other half. Now for the first year, the fruit trees that had the fertilizer did very well. But after that, they started doing rather poorly and ultimately died. Now they dug them all up and looked at the roots to see what was happening. Well, the roots of the plants where they put the fertilizers had wrapped around in a circle, kind of like they were in a pot, and didn't spread out, didn't go anywhere. Ultimately choked the plant, and the plant and tree died. Whereas the other ones that got no fertilizer in the planting hole did fine, and after 3 years they were doing great. So master gardeners will always recommend that you do what's called a side dress. Plant in the hole, fill the hole in, and then put your fertilizer around the outside. You can dig it in and water it in, or if you're using a liquid fertilizer, just pour it on. This will do much better and won't hurt the plant. It's a much better way of doing it. You shouldn't be putting anything in the planting hole. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is trimming your tomato plants. This is another one that I hadn't talked about yet. It was going to be the subject of my next video. And the idea here is, if you have a tomato stem, and I'll try and put up a picture to this, and there are branches coming off the main stem, right in the armpit of that stem, you'll often get what's called a sucker stem. Now, many people will recommend trimming this off. Now, is this a good idea? Well, it really depends on where you live. Now, if you live someplace cold and your growing season is short, then yes, actually it's a good idea, because what happens is the plant will start producing fruit more quickly. So if you have a short growing season, this is actually a good idea. However, if you live in the desert like me, or any place warm where you have a long growing season, this is actually a bad idea, because those sucker branches will actually flower and produce fruit eventually. So by cutting them off, you're actually lowering your total harvest you're going to get from that plant. And so there's really no reason to do it. It's just a lot of extra work for no benefit. So if you live someplace warm, don't trim those sucker branches off. They'll be fine. Just leave them alone. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is a little specific, and you may not ever need to know this, but if you ever need to know it, you're going to be really glad you watched this video. So I'm of course a guy, and guys have a tendency to do as I say, not as I do kind of mentality sometimes. So everyone knows that when you're handling hot peppers, you should wear gloves. But sometimes, we just think, it's no big deal, I'll just wash my hands afterwards. Well, this is especially true if you're going to be cutting the peppers open, touching the seeds. Now the skin on our hands are kind of thick, so you probably are not going to feel the burn on your hands unless it's a super hot or something like that. But unfortunately, washing your hands doesn't really get the capsaicin off your skin. So what happens is later, maybe you're using the restroom, and then you start noticing, what is that burning? Oh my God. So what do you do about it? Well, that's when you grab some olive oil. It is really good. There are lots of places on the human body that are way more sensitive than the skin on your hands. And if you happen to be unlucky enough to get some capsaicin on them and it starts to burn, you're going to be glad you have some olive oil nearby. It really cuts the capsaicin and will stop the burn. Now, does it work on female parts? Probably. I don't know. I haven't tested it. I like to think women are smart enough not to do that, but it's probably happened. So if it does happen to you, grab some olive oil. It'll really help. So those are the 10 tips I wanted to talk about. Now, really quickly, I'm going to do an 11th tip, bonus sort of. And this is, you really should think twice about who you're getting your garden information from. You know, vet these people before you start, putting things in your garden and on your plants that was recommended by, some Yahoo on Facebook. I myself have recently unsubscribed to most of my Facebook and Reddit garden groups, because I've noticed that the information that they're giving back and forth to each other is just not accurate. You really should think twice about who you're getting your information from. And websites really aren't a whole lot better. Any Yahoo with $8 to register a domain name can create a website and put whatever the heck they want on it. So I did a full video on this recently, and I talked about some different people that I definitely recommend. My favorite one was Fred over at Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast. He has been a master gardener for more than 30 years, and he has a lot of really educated guests he has on his show, as well as Debbie Flowers. She's also a 30 plus years master gardener and a retired horticultural professor. Between the two of them, they have more than 60 years of experience being master gardeners. These guys really know what they're talking about, and 60 years is more than most of us have even been alive. So these guys really know their stuff way better than just, some idiot on Facebook who probably are just repeating something they heard some other idiot say on Facebook. So do your own research. Even stuff that I say, do your own research. You'll be glad you did. So that's about it. Like I said, this may be the last video I do for a while. If you like the video, say so. I haven't been getting a lot of feedback. If you want me to keep doing it, let me know that you're enjoying the videos, you're getting something out of it. There's a donate link down below, just saying. And if I don't see you, happy gardening.